Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I'm one of your hosts, Derick. With me, as always, is Evan. Good day, sir.
Good day to you, sir.
All right, let's dive right in. We're still in Genesis 2:8, which means I probably should read it again, not just assume you remember it from last episode. And the Lord planted a garden in Eden in the east, and there he put the man whom he had formed. So
Excellent.
this I want to focus here on that little phrase in the middle, in the east. It's a weird little detail to include.
Yeah.
One of the things we're doing here, particularly with these early first chapters of Genesis leading up to Abraham, is because they're told in such a different style, we're considering no detail as extemporaneous, right? These are all very carefully orchestrated words. And I do think often a historical, like a strictly historical approach to these chapters can lead to these details having little significance beyond, material fact. And we can sort of brush over them. Oh, that's where the garden happened to be located, and it has no significance beyond that. But a verse like this, I think, is a fine example where the placement of the garden, it's not just a technical detail. It's actually a rather significant element of what's going on here. So regardless of translation choices, because there are several different ways that phrase is addressed, several commentaries that I've looked at explain that the Hebrew here is describing something we don't quite translate perfectly well in English. It's describing the location of the garden as within Eden, but right on the eastern edge. So this ties into what we talked about last episode, right? A garden being the tamed wilderness. Well, this garden is right between the tamed wilderness and Eden proper, right? So there's some interesting things you can take away from this. The first thing, and this is important in terms of going to what we talked about previously, the idea of this story as the fall of man potentially implying that, well, man was supposed to remain in the garden forever and all of that. Well, humanity is not yet welcomed into Eden proper in this story. Right? Because if it's a garden at the eastern edge, it's right on the edge.
So the name of the garden is not Eden.
Right. Okay. Right. The name of the region, the area, the city is Eden. And this is a garden right on the eastern edge of it.
Oh, okay. Okay. That makes more sense. Yeah. And Garden of Eden that's not the proper preposition. We're using an improper preposition typically. It should be called the Garden in Eden.
Yeah. Although
that'll be a more.
Yeah, even that it's like it's the garden at the edge of Eden.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's in Eden.
It is
proper.
in.
It's the only.
Yeah.
Or it's in the region known as Eden, but it's on the eastern edge of Eden.
It's the border.
But it's not
more or less.
If you refer to Eden, you're not referring to the garden.
Right.
The garden is a part of Eden.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yes.
Okay. That I never knew.
So of still may work, right? It still may work, but it's not as precise as we might like to use otherwise.
Yeah, we wouldn't typically, maybe in the old sense of prepositions are hard in a language, I guess. They're typically very, very difficult to figure out exactly what they're referencing, but
yeah, they're a little imprecise
at times. In the old sense of it would maybe work, but I don't think we use it typically that way.
I don't think so anymore. No.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because it is the garden belonging to Eden, but nowadays we do tend to use of in the place of saying named.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's not quite accurate.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
So looking at this idea of being the edge and man being placed there, we see the idea that sort of the proper place for humanity at this, particular time here is at the edge of Eden, right? And we'll later see in Revelation whenever we get to that book, decades from now, we'll later see that man is meant to reside in the city of Eden proper, the New Jerusalem that, basically covers the earth, in a way, kind of. We're meant to reside there, but we're not ready yet. And so that is why we're placed in the garden. And so I guess you could say, well, maybe we could go either way, with that. Maybe we could have gone into the city proper. I would argue maybe that's not the case, actually. And we'll get to why that is further on in this story, maybe at the end too, with some wrap up thoughts. But again, that's one of those interpretive choices that we talked about early on, where this story makes you make interpretive choices. So one of the interpretive choices you would look at is this idea. Okay, when we get to this idea of being on the edge, were we meant to be good gardeners and then be invited into the city, or were we always meant to develop our gardening skills and then go out into the wilderness and reclaim that and have it be enveloped by the city? There's sort of two ways you could go with that. I would argue the idea of going out and subduing the earth implies this idea that you're always meant to go actually out from the garden into the wilderness. That was always where you were supposed to head. But so
it also connects. We've talked in the past about humanity being viewed as a bridge.
Yeah.
Between two orders, and there's a way in which this sort of functions the same way.
Yeah.
Is being on the edge. That's again where humanity's living at this place where it's in between two things. It's in between two ways of the world functioning, I suppose. And we're intended to exist at that middle ground.
In between.
Or we're established at that middle ground, which is that's interesting.
Yeah, so that gets to, I think it's innate within humans. Because you see often even the secularist, we talked about this, I think, already with the environmentalist perspective, views humanity as like this outside, force within nature, not something that emerged from nature, right? Which you would think would be the naturalist perspective, but instead they view us as like this outside invader that's been imposed upon nature, which ties into the other ancient religious ideas, was very much that same idea. Here, this is a way of saying that innate feeling that I think humans have, this idea that you don't quite fit. Well, there's something to that. You're not meant to quite fit. You're meant to be that bridge. You're meant to be this place that is on the edge between the two. That's sort of what you're designed for.
Yeah.
Is that gardener idea. So all right, I want to look here closely at the idea of the East. We had in theory 4, or I guess if you start including, northeast, we could start, 8. We could get to 8, I guess. But you had these directions that could be chosen from, these 4 directions. So the idea that the eastern edge is chosen, that's important. When we look at the idea of direction in the Bible, there's a pattern in the Bible that exists with regards to direction. And it's that in the Old Testament, movement to the east or to the south is movement away from God. And this becomes particularly important in Genesis and in Exodus, right? We note that later on in this same story, Adam and Eve are sent out from the garden to the east. They are pushed away from God, because going to the west would be to Eden proper, closer to God. So they're sent to the east. They're moved away from God. Movement to the north and west then is movement back towards God. And we'll get to it eventually, but these things are actually inverted, these directional ideas in the New Testament, which is interesting. But there's significance to this where we see, we'll get to it in more detail when we get to it, but Adam and Eve are sent out to the east, and then Cain, who commits, a much greater sin, the worst sin a human can commit, killing another human, is sent even further to the east, right? So it's further away from God. And there is throughout the Bible repeated trips down south into Egypt. And the word down is used very specifically, which, by the way, it's interesting. They didn't know the idea of like a North Pole and a South Pole. And we've arbitrarily decided that one is on top and the other and up and down and all that. It is kind of weird to think of going down to Egypt when the Nile River flows northward. You would kind of think of that as going up then, because if you were to go up to the source of the Nile, you'd be going south, but it would feel like you're going up, right? Because the water flows down. But it is repeatedly phrased as going down into Egypt, right? And we'll get into the significance of Egypt more, I think, when we get into Abraham. But just going down into Egypt is going like deeper into the world and worldly pursuits and worldly interests, because Egypt is this center of worldly wealth at the time. Right. So that's really to go into the world, is to go down into Egypt, right? Further away from the spiritual things of God. And of course, we know that you return northward from Egypt to the promised land. So that's going back towards God. This comes up too. We'll just throw it in here real quickly. Jesus, right? After he's born, he and his parents flee down to Egypt. And the point there being that the Holy Land had become so corrupted that, God was safer in the worldly aspect of things rather than in the Holy Land. That's how screwed up the Holy Land had become at that time. So there's a lot of significance to that. So that's why when we see the garden, it's at the eastern edge of Eden, not the western edge, but at the eastern edge of Eden, and we go out to the east from that. So Eden is basically or the Garden of Eden, I'm sorry, is it's barely in Eden. It's barely with God, and you're right on the edge of that wilderness that is further away from God. So it's, I mean, I since really exploring this, I just think of the Garden of Eden as that place that's kind of between true proper Eden and the untamed wilderness.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and I think when we look at that, we can see that God's describing this kind of razor's edge that humanity occupies. Right. And so we got to this, you could go west into Eden, could go east out of Eden. I think we are always destined to go east out of Eden, but I understand the argument. You could go the other way too.
Well, that's where the interpretive choice is interesting. It's like, well, why wouldn't God? I mean, it comes down to the being established, that we keep coming back to, being established in between two worlds. And perhaps our intent is to be the intermediary between those two worlds. And maybe in a more fundamental sense, when you're closer to it, it is more attractive to go towards the spiritual world, because it's going to be better. So if we were established on the west side, or if we were established in Eden proper, we wouldn't ever want to go out into the eastern, and we wouldn't be pulled out that way. But ultimately we are pulled out that way because we're established on that side and on that edge.
Maybe.
Yeah, that does. Yeah. I don't know.
Or maybe that's what we were always meant to do, right? Expand Eden by going out and taming the wilderness.
Yeah, exactly. But the thing is what you run into then is this is where you run into difficult interpretive choices, I guess, is well, what caused or forced man to go out in that eastern direction? I mean, ultimately it was rebellion that causes them to go that way.
Right.
And it's framed as a punishment.
Right. Right. And this is the thing we talked about where, I mean, a part of me looks at it and says, man was always eventually going to sin because we are less than God. And if you're less than God and you are presented with choices in front of you and you have limits to your understanding and all of that, eventually you'll choose the wrong thing.
Possibly. I mean, then that brings a more complex topic that we don't have very much standing, at least from the Bible, to talk about too much, but would bring in divine beings or heavenly beings,
right,
as to saying, it's like, well, you can look at Satan and say, well, that shows that heavenly beings can rebel. But then you look at heavenly beings.
Well, they are
say,
also less than
are
God.
They all exactly? That's what I'm saying. Is are they bound to then? Because your argument is, if you're less than God, you're bound to rebel. And it's like, well, does that mean all heavenly beings are bound to rebel?
If you're less than God and given free will.
Yeah, well, that could be. Yeah. Or if you're less than God and you're established as this intermediary and you're established in the world. That's why I'm saying it's like, it's important that we're established east of Eden as opposed to west of Eden, because, or in Eden proper, if that's representing being this firmly established, let's say in the heavenly realm or close to God, or in a closer way with God, then there's no chance that we ever go east of Eden, because perhaps that's so, or I mean, I guess maybe Satan does, but that is so attractive that it is less likely, I guess, that we would go that way, even if we're given free will. And that's just an interpretive choice too, maybe. I think, is you're deciding, is the issue that humanity's given free will and heavenly beings aren't? Or is the issue that humanity is established with this much closer interaction with the world, with the potential for chaos?
And we'll have to address it when we get closer to it, right? But we might argue too that when we get to Genesis 6, right before the flood narrative, this idea of the sons of God marrying the daughters of man, and there is many interpretations that would say that's talking about heavenly beings, and it's talking about divine beings falling, basically. And so again, free will, and you're less than God. I don't know, I think those things, there's more mystery to that than we know, obviously, with regard to the divine in that sense, the spiritual realm, if you will.
Well, that's where you stretch into more speculation.
Right.
Exactly. So that's why the question is a bit more of is more interpretive than the other ones.
Right.
That's more you deciding, like, where do you stand? I think I think the big takeaway though is looking that humanity's proper position is that intermediary, is that we oftentimes feel, I think that one of the issues we run into frequently is finding balance between where we're supposed to be. And I think this almost reinforces that that's the challenge that as a human you should be running into.
Yes. Yeah.
If you feel like you're running into that over and over again, like you can't figure out how you're supposed to balance, let's say, the spiritual and the physical, it's like, you should be running into that.
And because these themes are repeated, this will come up again when we get to the story of Cain and Abel, because it's actually addressing that idea directly of being in between and not being too far to one end or the other. So
exactly.
All right, with that, we'll wrap up this episode. Be sure to like, subscribe, review the podcast, rate, whatever the kind things to do are on the platform of your choice. And any thoughts, leave them in comments or shoot us an email, unschooltheology@protonmail.com, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.